Boldwood presents One Summer Sunrise, written by Shari Low and read by Helen McAlpine. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Saturday the 3rd of July 2021, 8 to 10 a.m. Chapter 1. Maisie McTeer. Somewhere in that hazy place between being asleep and awake, Maisie decided that as dreams went, this one was pretty rubbish. There were no golden sands or deep blue seas, not even a half-naked Chris Hemsworth in indecently small swim shorts, holding up a cocktail while waiting for her on a sun lounger for two. Just a foggy image of her ex, Nathan, running away from her, while she stood, dressed in white, watching him go. And the noise. Ouch, the noise. The violent thudding sound was so loud, so persistent, it felt like it was making her ears bleed. At first she thought it was the panicked, distraught beat of her heart, but the more she came round, the louder and clearer it got. Bugger. Someone was banging on the front door. She paused to pray that her sister would answer it, then remembered Hope was on an overnight shift at the hospital and wouldn't be home yet. More banging. Whoever it was, they weren't giving up. Groaning, Maisie climbed out of bed, immediately regretting it when she had to hang on to the ironing board that was leaning against the wall until a sudden bout of dizziness left her. Damn. She'd forgotten to factor in her inevitable hangover. The last margarita before bed had been a really bad idea, as had the 6 she'd had before it. The downside of drinking alone on the couch with only the Sex and the City reruns on Netflix for company was that there was no one there to question the wisdom of an impromptu cocktail party for one. Palms against the walls for support all the way to the front door, Maisie winced as the decibels shattered her eyeballs. Was it possible for a brain to actually explode? If so, the cream walls were about to be decorated with a natty combination of grey matter, Cointreau, tequila and lime juice. She wrenched open the door, yelling, Okay, I hear you." As her eyes adapted to the blinding sunlight, there was a horrified pause, then a strangled yelp of, "Oh Jesus, sissy!" Suddenly, very awake and alert, Maisie gasped as she saw her best mate standing on the front step, face pink, leaning over her 9 months pregnant space hopper stomach, both hands on her knees. "How long," Sissy panted, "does it take you," another pant, "to answer a fricking door?" "Sorry, come in. What can I do? Is the baby coming now? Towels! I need towels!" she bellowed to no one. Sissy's breath was coming in short bursts, blowing away the tendrils of her long, fiery red hair that were falling from the pleat that curled around her shoulder. "Nope, we're just rehearsing." "Seriously?" She glanced up at her with absolute incredulity. "No, of course I'm not serious. Shit. I hope this baby isn't listening. It'll be terrified that you're one of its responsible adults." Her eyes rose upwards, then narrowed pointedly as she took in Maisie's dishevelled appearance. "Did you sleep in a bush last night?" Maisie went for deflective indignation. "Are we really doing this right now? Let me grab my bag and we'll be at the hospital in 10 minutes. Sissy shook her head, hands still on knees. "Nope. It's okay. Cole's here." She gestured behind her and for the first time, Maisie noticed the Volvo at the end of her path, with Sissy's husband in the driver's seat, anxiety knitting his eyebrows together. He threw up his arms in a questioning movement. "I've told him to stay in the car and keep it running," Sissy explained. "Okay, I'll come without my bag then," Maisie offered, taking a step out the door, caring not a jot that birthing partners didn't usually show up in pyjamas and bare feet, sporting hair like a pillow that had been shredded by a fly mow. "No, wait!" Sissy put her hand up. "There's been a change of plan. I need you to do something else for me today," she went on, wincing mid-sentence. Maisie felt a surge of dread. Sissy had this day planned with military precision. There was even a flowchart, laminated and stuck to Maisie's fridge, so she could memorise every detail of her role in the step-by-step process between Sissy going into labour and the arrival of her child. According to Mrs. Control Freak, the minute Sissy's waters broke or she had her first contraction, Cole would grab the hospital bag that had been packed and sitting by the front door since halfway through her pregnancy. He'd then whisk his wife to Glasgow Central Hospital, coming via Maisie's house to collect her. Maisie and Cole would alternate as birthing partners and general helpers during the early hours of labour. "I don't want him at the business end," Sissy had categorically stated, "so you're it for all things below the waist." Then, when the baby was close to arriving, Maisie would honour the hospital's one partner in the delivery theatre rule by retreating to the waiting room and letting Sissy and Cole bring their firstborn into the world together. None of the flowchart scenarios covered Sissy's arriving at the door at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, telling an exceptionally hungover Maisie, suffering the effects of a bloodstream that was probably still 90% margarita, that there had been a change of plan. The only thing that terrified her more than one of Sissy's agendas was the thought of one of them being altered at the last minute. This couldn't be good. "Anything. What do you need?" "Please make it something simple, a skinny latte, the return of her beloved chunky cherry chubby stick, paper pants for the below-the-waist stuff." "I need you to work on the job I was supposed to be on today. A garden party. I've got Janice and Jane on set-up and food prep, and a dozen temp staff on their way for replenishment and table clearing. But the whole thing needs someone to oversee and coordinate everything and liaise with the organisers." Sissy's catering company, the Carrot Shtick, had been her friend's plan B when they'd graduated together from RADA 5 years ago. A year after leaving the academy, Maisie had still been in love with her career choice, despite only having landed a part as a psycho elf in Panto. However, Sissy had realised that she hated being skint, and that her dreams of being the next stand-up sensation probably weren't going to materialise anytime soon. So she'd taken over the slightly stale family business that she'd worked in part-time for years, renamed it, and applied her ferocious drive into making it the success it had become. Sissy had also given Maisie enough part-time ad hoc shifts over the years to keep her going between acting gigs and help pay the rent for the garden flat in Glasgow's West End that Maisie shared with Hope. "But you need me at the hospital for the business end," Maisie reminded Sissy gently, nodding pointedly towards Sissy's nether region when she vocalised the words business end. It was impossible to hide her disappointment. For months now, she'd been looking forward to the arrival of this new baby for many reasons. It was all those poetic things about a new dawn, a new life. But most of all, it would hopefully put an end to Sissy's frankly terrifying hormonal mood swings. Maisie had been forced to disarm her when she threatened a snarky delivery guy with a French baguette last week. "I do need you, but our actual business end needs you more. And you'll mostly love it, I promise. It's all our kind of people." Despite the anxiety of the moment, Maisie chuckled. "Our kind of people?" Sissy nodded. "Lovies. It's the end-of-term fundraiser for the drama department at Glasgow College of Performing Arts. A few of the students who are graduating have organised it. Actually, the one I've dealt with most said she knew you." "What's her name?" Carney Bassett?" "Yes! Carney's lovely. I've met her a few times when I've been in giving a hand with her productions. She's a really talented set designer," Maisie said, thinking this might not be too bad. Between jobs, she occasionally helped out at the college, doing workshops for the students who were focused on musical theatre or drama. She'd also helped coach the cast of their last couple of productions. For Maisie, it was just a fun way to hold jaded cynicism at bay, by tapping into the enthusiasm and bright talent that was coming into the industry. Carney definitely qualified in that category. Maisie could feel a glimmer of enthusiasm, but it was tempered by the feeling that there was a catch coming. "Hang on, you said I'd mostly love? What's not to like?" "It's, well..." Sissy was stuttering again. Another contraction on the way? Anxiety kicking in? Gut-wrenching pain? Maisie soon realised it was none of the above. Instead, it was the absolute dread of a pal asking another pal to do the unimaginable. "It's in the grounds of the Lomond House estate." Maisie's soul curled up and died. Not there. Anywhere but there. She hadn't been back since... No! Knife. Heart. Sissy immediately cut off her objection with a frankly unconvincing scream of "Ah!" as she clutched her belly again. Maisie's head tilted questioningly. "Did you just fake a contraction to manipulate me into doing this?" Sissy had been a good actress in college, but not that bloody good. The pregnant one gave a weak shrug of confession. "Low blow, I know, but I'm desperate. I can't let them down. Janice and Jane can handle the actual buffet, but it needs to be organised, and you're my only hope." Ugh! Ugh! She buckled as she got the last word out, then uttered another pain-laden "Ah!" Maisie knew she was beat as she put her hands out and let Sissy hang on to them while she endured another contraction, a genuine one this time. Okay, breathe, just breathe. I've got you." Maisie winced through the agonising pain of Sissy crushing her knuckles with newfound superhuman strength. Unable to contain himself any longer, the gorgeous Cole jumped out of the car and raced up the path, face aghast. "Sissy, babe, come on, let's go," he begged, with all the urgency of a man who didn't want his first child to be born on the front step of a Victorian terrace garden flat, in between two plastic topiary bushes and a doormat that said, "Come on in, bring wine." "Please, Maisie," Sissy pleaded, coming out of the contraction with more deep breaths. "I'll give you anything. You can even have this kid if I don't like the look of it." Maisie laughed, in spite of the turn of events, the horror of what was being asked of her and the crushed knuckles. "I'll do it, but you can keep the kid. Pay me in gin and therapy." "Oh, thank God. Thank you. I've already emailed you all the details," Sissy admitted, a little shamefaced about the presumption. The two women hugged, before Cole eventually prized his wife from Maisie's arms. Having lost the power of her hands, she gave a weak wave. "Okay, go, I'll take care of everything. Don't worry. And I'll come to the hospital when it's over. If you're any kind of pal, you'll keep your legs crossed until I get there. I love you guys." "We love you," Sissy shouted over her shoulder as she waddled back towards the Volvo. "And there's a cake for the fundraiser. It's to be cut up and served with the coffees. It's the 1-tier sponge in the fridge at the warehouse next to the cake with the penis on it for the hen night that's booked for Thursday night. I made it early in case this happened." 1-tier sponge next to penis cake. Got it," Maisie yelled back, wondering if Mrs. McPherson next door was clutching her rosary beads and praying for her soul yet. She watched as Cole helped Sissy into the car, then accelerated off from the curb with a screech that would make Vin Diesel anxious. Maisie took a step backwards, closed the door, then thudded her forehead against it. It crossed her mind that maybe that was the answer. She couldn't possibly oversee a catering operation for 200 guests if she was in hospital with concussion. The pain of knocking herself out wouldn't be any worse than the one that was piercing her heart right now. How ironic. Only last week she'd auditioned for the lead role in a new Netflix original series called The Clyde, a Glasgow crime show that had the potential to be huge. Not that she had any chance of landing it, but still. It was ironic that her own life was rivaling the kind of storylines that belonged in a soap opera. Any minute now, her long-lost evil twin would knock at the door and attempt to steal her life. Well, she could have it. Especially if the evil twin had experience in part-time catering and could take over the function this afternoon. What were the chances of the stars aligning this way? Why had Sissy gone into labour this morning? Why was she short-staffed, and why did this party have to be in the grounds of Lomond House, the place that, more than any other, kept Maisie's nightmares alive and made her heart ache? Maisie didn't know the answers to any of those questions. All she knew for sure was that, new baby aside, this had the potential to be the second worst day of her life, because today was now the day she'd be revisiting the place where the love of her life had once proposed to her, the place where they'd planned to marry, and where only 2 months ago he had jilted her at the altar. Chapter 2. Scott Bassett. Scott's heart was beating out of his chest and sweat was dripping from every pore in his body. Jesus, it hurt.
Come on, is that all you've got? Seriously, you're losing your touch, mate.
The 6'3" guy who'd just knocked him on his arse ribbed him. For the last hour, they'd been playing a game of one-on-one basketball, using the net that had been attached to the back of the garage as a Christmas surprise for a teenage Scot in 1998. Back then, he'd wanted to be Michael Jordan. Now, he'd settle for putting the ball in the hoop without pulling a muscle. The thunder in his ears blocked out the noise of the sliding doors from the kitchen being pulled open, but not the sound of the menacing shout that came next. Thankfully, his mum's house was a 3-bedroom bungalow at the end of a quiet road in the village of Fruitown on the outskirts of Glasgow, and the nearest neighbours were off visiting their family in Fort William this weekend, so there would be no objections to the sound of the thudding ball or the raised voice of warning.
"Carson Cook, you big Egypt. If you injure my son on the day of my granddaughter's party, there'll be carnage, and you won't come out of it well."
The threat came from Scott's mother, the indomitable Sonia Bassett, who'd slid open the glass doors from the kitchen and now stood in the doorway, clutching a spatula, looking dangerously threatening despite her pink fluffy dressing gown and head full of rollers.
"You two are 38-year-old men. You've got no business getting up to all that nonsense out there. You'll do yourself an injury."
Scott took advantage of the distraction to spring to his feet, grab the basketball and dunk it, winning the game. Carson, meanwhile, regressed from a capable, super-fit, 6-pack sporting engineer in the Royal Air Force to a blushing, slightly podgy, red-haired teenager who was mortified because he'd just been chided by his best pal's mum.
"Sorry, Mrs. B, but he started it."
The age-old protest reduced the lot of them to laughter.
"Right, well, your breakfast is about to go on the table, so stop all that messing around and come get it. Hose yourselves down first, because not even my cotton-fresh Yankee candles can handle all that sweat."
Carson picked the ball out of the Lelandi's, where it had landed after the dunk, and whistled.
"I swear to God, if the Russians ever get your mother on their side, the West doesn't stand a chance."
Scott threw his arm around the guy who'd been his best mate since they were using their jumpers as goalposts in primary school.
"You're not wrong. We try to use our powers for good, but it's not always possible. She threatened to punch a skinhead who skipped her at the handmade pizza counter in the supermarket last week. He's probably still cowering somewhere between the veg aisle and frozen foods."
Carson's low, throaty laugh was infectious, and Scott felt his cheeks begin to ache with smiling. As summer mornings went, this was pretty much perfect so far. He'd only stayed over at his old childhood home a handful of times since he'd married Kelly when they were just kids, straight out of school. Felt like yesterday, yet now the daughter they'd had when they were both 16 had just turned 22 and graduated with a degree in theatre studies. He'd been beyond proud when Carney had landed a job as an apprentice set designer, working for a theatre company in London. Today's party was more than just a fundraiser for the drama department she'd adored for the last 4 years. It was also a celebration of her graduation and a last hurrah before Carney left tomorrow, so most of the family were coming along to celebrate. His own house was overcrowded because Kelly's sister and brother-in-law had arrived yesterday and were staying over. So Kelly had suggested that Scott and Carson take his mum up on the offer of her 2 spare rooms. The alternative would have been for all 6'3" of Carson to crash in his usual spot on the couch in Scott and Kelly's 3-bedroom semi. Kelly had transformed the smallest bedroom into a dressing room with a sofa bed, but it was way too small for a man of Carson's size, so he inevitably slept in the living room. When he was full of beer, the couch was perfectly comfortable, but maybe not the best idea when there were other house guests who would have to trip over him to watch TV. Besides, Staying with his mum gave Scott and Carson the opportunity to relive countless nights of their youth, when Carson would be parked in Sonia's spare room, and they'd spend all day hanging out, playing basketball, Carson's game, and football, Scott's game. Their rivalry as fierce as Sonia's wrath when they were late coming in for their tea, or when a window or one of her prize garden gnomes was accidentally smashed with an errant ball. Scott nipped into his mum's pink-tiled ensuite to use her shower, while Carson used the spray over the bath in the main bathroom. Scott avoided that one, as it required a death-defying climb into a tiny bath, careful manoeuvring so as not to knock over several candles, a couple of bowls of potpourri, and dozens of hotel shampoo bottles his mum had acquired on her travels over the years, followed by a thigh-burning crouch in order to fit under the shower head. Carson had once said that getting into the cockpit of a Typhoon fighter jet was easier. 10 minutes after they were summoned, they were at the table with enough bacon, eggs, sausage and potato scones to feed a platoon, accompanied by the distant sound of his mum singing Patsy Cline's Crazy in another room. Without conscious thought, Scott realised he was humming along. Sonia's country music had been the soundtrack to his life, the reason he'd first picked up a guitar. It was also why, in the 90s era of Oasis and Blur, of indie rebels, rock and roll excess and Robbie Williams' Lion Pants, Scott had formed the Hollering Stetsons, the most uncool band in their school's history. They covered Tim McGraw songs, Garth Brooks, plenty of Conway Twitty, and on more than a few occasions the only people in the audience had been Carson, Kelly, Sonia and the band members' families. Except for the drummer, whose dad had disowned him after he heard them singing Islands in the Stream. Scott had even been saving the money from his weekend job in the local petrol station to go on his dream trip to Nashville. Looking back, he was pretty sure that every penny of his savings had eventually gone on baby stuff when they found out that Kelly was pregnant. He'd quit the band, the other Hollering Stetsons had gone their separate ways, and Scott had never made it further than 2 weeks in the Costa del Package tour. But they'd had Carney, and she was, without a single doubt, the best thing that had ever happened to him. Scott used a fork to load up his plate.
I'm grateful you made it today, bud. Carney would have been gutted if her godfather wasn't here.
Carson knocked back a slug of his black coffee.
Wouldn't have missed it. I've no idea how someone like you managed to raise such a cool, talented kid.
He immediately yelped as he felt the sting of a flicked finger on the back of his head, courtesy of Sonia, who had returned to the kitchen and passed behind him just as he'd insulted her beloved son. Carson had military training, and yet he'd just let a Glaswegian mother launch a surprise attack. Sonia gave him the pursed lips of terror, then leaned over, took a slice of toast from the pile, and bustled back out again with a "Watch yourself, Carson, cook." Despite the threats, the words came with an unmistakable hint of affection. They all knew that, deep down, Sonia Bassett had loved Carson almost as much as her own son, since Scott had sat next to him on their first day of school. The two boys had been inseparable from then until Scott married Kelly and Carson left to join the RAF. Scott's cheeks were aching again as he gave a self-deprecating shrug and addressed Carson's earlier point.
I've no idea either. Just one of those freak miracles. I put it down to Kelly's genes and luck. Anyway, come on, dish the details. Did Carney's tutorial on that dating app pay off? Are women lining up round the block to take you off the market?
On Carson's last visit, around 3 months before, Scott had watched with absolute hilarity as Carney had announced she was going to end Carson's single days by setting him up with a profile on Your Next Date and teaching him how to use it. Carson had gone along with it for a bit of fun, but Scott was pretty sure he'd then
deleted it the next day,
Carson admitted. Yep, that was exactly what Scott had guessed.
You're going to be single forever, Scott sighed. You lucky bastard.
Carson bit into the well-done sausage on the tip of his fork.
You don't mean that,
he said, grinning, then pausing his fork in mid-air as he re-evaluated his mate's expression.
Do you?
he added with obvious uncertainty. Scott exhaled, then, elbows on the table, he lowered his head and ran his fingers through his thick mop of dark blonde hair. He kept it short at the sides and back, longer on the top, and Carney made sure he navigated the dangerous line between looking good and trying too hard, giving cutting but well-intentioned advice, whether it was requested or not. "Dad, that T-shirt is like so last year, and send those jeans back to the 90s. I've no idea why some of my pals fancy you," she'd groan. "I mean, what's that about? I clearly need new friends." Then she'd soften it all by giving him a cheeky smile, and he'd crack up laughing at her cheek. When he raised his gaze from the table, he saw that Carson was still waiting for an answer. This was rarely chartered waters for them. In over 30 years of friendship, they'd discussed jobs, cars, houses, holidays, beer, aircraft, and dissected every sports league with the kind of analytical detail and insight that would qualify them for roles as TV pundits. But feelings? Relationships? Very occasionally, and only in the late hours when alcohol had blurred their inhibitions. Right now, he was entirely sober, but the words were rolling out on a train of anxiety. "I do. I can't make this work anymore, mate." "Make what work?" Scott pushed his plate away, stomach too clenched now to eat. "Marriage. Life." His friend's incredulity showed he wasn't taking this seriously. "Yeah, because it's so hard having a gorgeous wife, a great daughter, and a 9-to-5 job with a decent wage, and enough free time to pretty much do what you want." "None of that is what I want," Scott said simply, realising that saying it out loud was a visceral relief. Now that the words were out, more were tumbling behind them, his tones hushed so that his mother didn't overhear. "Don't get me wrong. Kelly and I made it work. And everything was worth it to have Carney. I'd do all the same way again to be her dad and raise her, but you're going to think I'm a prize prick here. I feel like now that she's going out into the world, my job is done." "Fuck," Carson said, uncharacteristically short on words. "What about Kelly?" The smell of food had gone from appetising to nauseating as Scott squirmed under the heat of the question he'd asked himself more times than he could count. "Mate, I love her, but—" He stopped, digging deep for more. "I married Kelly because she got pregnant when we were 16. I went into a job I hate because it helped support us. I'm not blaming anyone or moaning, but, you know, it's been this way for 22 years. These days, we're more like friends. We get on great, but are we madly in love? I don't think we ever were. I'm the only guy she's been with and vice versa. I've got to believe that she loves me in some way to have stuck around this long, but maybe she's just waiting it out for Carney to leave too." Carson thought about that for a moment. "Have you talked to her about it?" "No, not yet. I didn't want anything to overshadow Carney's last year with us. I was going to talk to her tonight. Carney's going out with her mates after the party, and Kelly's family will have headed off by then." "And what exactly are you going to tell her?" Carson probed, food long forgotten for them both. "That I want to split. That I've taken voluntary redundancy at work. Finish up next week." Carson didn't even try to disguise his shock. "Wait, you what? You've done it already? Without talking to her about it? Fuck, you're an idiot. Come on, pal. She deserves better than that." A red rash of embarrassment started to creep around Scott's neck. It was a dick move. He knew it. When the directors at his company had asked for voluntary redundancies, he'd initially discounted it. After starting as an apprentice on the factory floor of Strathmold Auto, making parts for car interiors, he'd worked his way up, with the help of an Open University degree, to a management position. He earned a decent salary now, had a smart company car and 30 days holiday a year. But the thought of spending another 20-odd years sitting behind the same desk every day made him want to put his head on his desk and weep. On the day of the deadline for the voluntary redundancies, some kind of madness had taken over him. He'd done a bit of research and found out that with his length of service, his redundancy offer was a good one. A year's salary, and he got to keep his full pension. It was too good to pass up. He'd wanted to discuss it with Kelly, but he knew she'd have argued about it, pointed out that it was a good job with good money, and it gave them a comfortable life. She wasn't wrong, but that just wasn't enough anymore, and here was a way out. On the spur of the moment, he'd snatched the deal just minutes before the deadline and planned to talk to her about it. But somehow...
I know, but it just never seemed like the right time. Carney had her finals and then...
He cut himself off, hearing the cowardice of his own words. The truth was, he couldn't face the inevitable backlash from his wife, his daughter, his mum, and even, yes, his mate, the one who was now looking at him like he'd lost his mind.
Look, I'm not proud of any of this, and I'll try to make it as painless as possible. I'm going to sign the house over to Kelly. The mortgage is just about paid off, so I'm not leaving her in the shit. I want her to have a good life. I just can't keep up the act that I'm the guy to share it.
Carson's sigh didn't do anything for Scott's rising defensiveness. His mate wasn't letting him off the hook.
And then what? What's your plan?
Scott shrugged.
Not entirely sure. I thought maybe I'd travel a bit. I always wanted to go to Nashville. Maybe play a bit of music. You know, that's what I dreamt of doing when we were young. Between savings and my redundancy money, even after I've cleared everything off, I'll have enough to last a year. Maybe 2 if I'm careful. The whole point is, I don't want any fixed plans. Every day since I left school, I've got up and done what was expected of me. I've worked hard, been a good dad, a decent husband. Now I just want to experience how it feels to wake up and do whatever I feel like doing.
He could hear how pathetic his gripes were. He sounded like a teenager trying to justify a gap year to his parents. Maybe if he'd had one of those, got all the wanderlust out of his system, then he wouldn't be in this situation now.
You know that most guys who are going through this kind of shit just call it a midlife crisis and buy a motorbike or a yoga mat?
Carson remarked, obviously unimpressed, but defaulting to humour as they'd done in every serious situation their whole lives. Scott lifted a bit of toast, glad of a break in the tension.
Yeah, I thought about that, but I'm terrified of bikes, and I'd look like a tit with a man bun. Pretty sure my mum would cut it off while I slept.
Stretching back in his seat, hands on the table, Carson let out a low, slow whistle, but said nothing. He'd always been the less talkative of the two. Scott was pretty sure his mate would have his back no matter what, but he realised the feeling that was making him sweat for the second time that morning was a blast of insecurity, and he needed to hear Carson tell him he'd stand by him.
What are you thinking, big guy?
Carson hesitated for a moment, ramping up Scott's anxiety.
Mate, whatever you need to do, I've got your back. And Kelly's. I'll try to help you both in any way I can, but... Yep, I think prize prick just about covers it.
Scott felt his stomach unclench just a smidgen.
Wise. Profound. Thank God you're here. If you ever leave the RAF, you're a shoo-in for work as a motivational speaker.
The two men sat in silence for a moment, both of them absorbing the discussion.
Is it the sausages?
Sonia said with suspicion, making them both flinch at yet another silent ninja entrance. Damn those fluffy slippers.
The butcher was shut, so they're the supermarket stuff. God knows what's in them.
It took the men a moment to realise she was trying to get to the bottom of why the plate of breakfast ingredients was still sitting in the centre of the table, barely touched.
Sausages are great, Mrs. B.
Carson assured her, holding up the half-eaten one on the end of his fork.
We just got distracted talking about football.
Ah, nothing changes. You two were always the same,
she said fondly, ruffling Scott's hair and letting her slippers head a retreat back to her room.
But bloody hurry up, because your Kelly will hit the roof if we're late. Big day today, son. Big day.
Big day indeed. It was the day that they would celebrate their gorgeous, smart, brilliant daughter's graduation. It was the day that they would say goodbye before she flew the nest. And today was going to be the day that Scott dropped the pretense of contentment and told his wife that he was leaving her. Chapter 3. Kelly Bassett. At first, Kelly wasn't sure what had woken her. Perhaps it was Carney's arm, now stretched across Kelly's torso. Or maybe the sun streaming through the gap in the curtains that she'd forgotten to close before they'd fallen asleep. A bang from downstairs told her differently. Kelly knew with absolute certainty that it was her brother-in-law, Rick, already up and causing chaos in Kelly's spotless kitchen. Not that her kitchen was always so immaculate, but some kind of hostessy duty compelled her to clean for 3 days before her family stayed over. And besides, it had been a welcome diversion from the stresses of the last couple of weeks.
If it pisses you off, tell him to stop bloody doing it,
Scott would say every time they came to visit, and Rick rose at the crack of dawn and then took over the kitchen. It was a chef thing, her sister would tell her. It was always on the tip of Kelly's tongue to answer back that no, it was an asshole thing. Not that she disliked her brother-in-law. Quite the opposite. Their relationship was complicated. Next-door neighbours as kids, he was her oldest friend, her person, long before he got his first Michelin star, long before he opened his own restaurant, and long before he married her younger sister. When they were teenagers, they'd even dated for a while before she called it off and started going out with Scott. It was the right decision. Every time she looked at her daughter, she knew that. Her gaze went to Carney, lying next to her, her beautiful, self-assured girl. In the waking hours, her daughter was a quick-witted, independent, impressive young woman. But now, asleep, her long brown hair framing around her makeup-free face, she was still Kelly's little girl, and looked barely older than she had when Kelly would tuck her in, read her a story, then kiss her forehead goodnight. The thought made tears pool inside her bottom lids, and she swallowed back the lump of nostalgia in her throat. "Pull it together, Kel," she chided herself. "Get a grip." Carney murmured, then rolled over, still in a deep sleep, as Kelly lifted her daughter's arm and slid out of bed. Not that she'd vocalised it, but she was glad that Scott had stayed at his mum's house and given her and their daughter the perfect final night together under the same roof. Snuggled up in bed after everyone else was asleep, armed with popcorn, Kelly in a pale grey onesie and Carney in a Britney Spears t-shirt, they'd watched Legally Blonde for the millionth time. She'd miss this, every moment of it. As mother and daughter, they'd come through the slammed doors of puberty, the teenage sulks and the period of discovery, when Carney was finding out who she really was. And now they were something different. Friends. She just hoped they'd still be as close despite the miles between them, the excitement of Carney's new life, and the fact that Kelly might be about to drop a bombshell into their family's future. That was for later, though. She wouldn't allow anything to spoil Carney's day, her last as their child under their roof, before she got on that flight tomorrow morning to start her new life in London. Kelly knew she was luckier than some mums. Carney had stayed at home while she was studying theatre at the Glasgow College of Performing Arts, so Kelly had had her girl with her for 22 years. Now she was going. It was time to slap on a smile and be happy that her daughter had landed the job of her dreams. How times changed. Kelly had taken the first job she could get after Carney was born, as a receptionist in a local estate agent, the same one that she managed now, more than 20 years later. It hadn't been her passion or the job of her dreams, but she'd made a success of it and she enjoyed it. For Carney, Her new role as an apprentice set designer in a small London theatre was so much more than that. It was the career she'd always wanted, one she'd studied for, worked towards for years, and Kelly couldn't be more thrilled that she'd achieved it, even if it did mean living 400 miles apart. That thought made her stomach lurch, and she paused, inhaled, waited for the feeling to pass. When it did, she pulled on a robe from the back of the bedroom door, then made a pit stop at the bathroom to brush her teeth and pull her long, tawny hair up into a high ponytail. She'd usually be applying her makeup and getting ready for her Saturday morning viewings by this time, but she'd taken this whole week off to spend with Carney. Rubbing a quick layer of moisturiser over her face, she knew she could still pass for 30, a birthday that had been in her rear-view mirror for 8 years. Although, much as she might look 30 on the outside, right now, she was so tired that she felt a couple of decades older on the inside. Shirking off the thought, she made it to the hallway outside her bedroom, surprised when she spotted her sister, Sabrina, sitting on the top step. Their mother had been a fan of Charlie's Angels back in the 70s, and Kelly and Sabrina had been two of the original detectives in the show. If Kelly had been a boy, there was every chance she'd have spent her married life dealing with the inevitable bind of being called Bosley Bassett after the male on the team. Sabrina caught her eye and budged over to let Kelly join her, a facsimile of countless times as children when they'd sit on the top stair in their parents' terraced house, reluctant to go downstairs because they could hear one or both of them on the warpath. It had been a blessing when they'd divorced, and an even greater shock when they'd realised that they missed the marital disharmony and remarried 10 years later. They lived in the Lake District now, but hadn't made the trip north because they said they were minimising their carbon footprint. Kelly had told them she absolutely understood, but she wasn't sure she did. Missing their granddaughter's celebration because they didn't want to make a 3-hour drive. It made no sense to her at all. But then, she thought, desperately pressing on the lid of that can of worms, understanding her parents' self-absorbed, disconnected ways had always been a challenge.
"Morning, sis. Did you sleep okay?"
Sabrina and Rick had slept in Carney's double bed.
"Yeah, right up until Gordon Ramsay got up and went to work downstairs."
Kelly playfully nudged her sister's shoulder. They were almost 6 years apart in age, and Sabrina had gone to college in Florida on an athletic scholarship when she was a teenager, planning to study for a business degree and then return home. However, she'd ended up marrying her college sweetheart and staying there for 5 more years. The two women had only got close after Sabrina's marriage broke down, and she'd returned to the UK with only a suitcase, a devastated heart, and a bitter taste caused by finding out her husband had been sleeping with a waitress at their local bar for months. Now, especially this morning, with both of them makeup-free and with the same ponytails in their chestnut hair, they could be twins.
"Is there a reason you're sitting here instead of lying in bed or going down there to join him?"
Kelly asked gently.
"I'm psyching myself up," Sabrina confessed. "If I go down there, he'll give me jobs to do, and I don't think I can handle the pressure. He lost 2 sous chefs last week. One of them spray-painted chef as a CUNT on the staff room wall before he left. I think he's misunderstood,"
Sabrina added, making them both giggle, as it was so clearly untrue. Rick was hot-headed. He was a perfectionist. He could be wholly unreasonable. And no, it wasn't a complete surprise that the C word would be used in his biographical information.
"You've got a lot to answer for, Kelly Bassett,"
Sabrina added tartly, pulling out the often-used rebuke. Kelly didn't argue. She was the one who'd reintroduced Rick to Sabrina when she'd come home from the USA. The last time he'd seen her younger sister, she'd been an 18-year-old kid, but by the time she returned, she was a gorgeous 28-year-old woman. Their chemistry had been instant, and they'd married within the year. Sabrina accepted him for all his flaws and eccentricities, while he encouraged her to loosen up and enjoy life. Kelly could see they were good for each other.
"Any word from Mum and Dad?"
Sabrina asked, pivoting to a different subject. Kelly nodded. "They're definitely not coming. Mum says it's too far and they don't want to waste petrol as that puts money in the pockets of the oil and gas companies that are secretly running the government. Sabrina looked surprised.
But I thought they bought shares in BP.
They have, but only because they're hedging their bets. Dad's obsessed with preserving resources because he says there's about to be some kind of energy apocalypse. Apparently it might be something to do with Brexit, the Dalai Lama, China, and Elvis is probably involved too.
Sounds about right,
Sabrina agreed. They were well used to their parents' conspiracy theories. They were the only kids in school whose parents built an underground bunker next to their whirligig.
Let's do a DNA test and see if we're actually theirs. I honestly have my doubts. People keep telling me I'm a dead ringer for a young Joan Collins. It's not too late for me to expose the truth and get in her will.
Kelly managed to keep the volume down in her giggle. You're also a dead ringer for our mother, so I wouldn't hold out much hope. She put her head on her sister's, so they were like two buildings leaning into each other for support. I'm glad you're here.
Me too, Sabrina told her. Just tell me the plan so I'm not late and I can make sure our temperamental chef is ready on time.
Without lifting her head, Kelly ran through the itinerary. OK, Scott, Carson and Sonia should be here around 12 o'clock for a pre-party refreshment. Then we'll leave at around 1 o'clock. You're taking Sonia to pick up Scott's granddad, and I'll head straight down to Loch Lomond with Scott, Carney and Carson. Carney was one of the organisers, so she just wants to get there early to make sure everything is going smoothly. I'm really looking forward to it, although I could quite happily have stayed in bed for another couple of... The wave of nausea was upon her before she even realised it was coming, and she almost dislocated Sabrina's jaw as she leapt up and darted to the bathroom behind them, throwing herself over the toilet bowl, no time to even close the door behind her. No, not today. Bugger. Stomach empty, retching finally over, Kelly slumped on the floor and rested the back of her head on the tiled wall behind her. Only then did she see that Sabrina had followed her into the room and had closed the door behind her. No escape. Now she was sitting on the bath, staring at her with something between confusion and dread.
Tell me it's food poisoning,
her sister begged, her voice so much smaller than it had been just a few moments before. I don't know, Kelly stuttered, all too aware that her answer had the potential to break Sabrina's heart.
But it might not be,
Sabrina asked, unwilling or unable to flat out ask what she needed to know. Kelly thought about lying to save her sister's feelings, but what was the point? They knew each other inside out, and Sabrina wouldn't be fooled. Lying would only make things worse. She shook her head gently, aware that any sudden movements could cause another rush of nausea. Might not be, she admitted, as much to herself as to Sabrina. Sabrina wasn't letting go.
Are you late?
The cool porcelain of the tiles was beginning to make the queasiness subside. Just a few days. This was the 4th morning in a row that she'd thrown up before breakfast. It was time to stop kidding herself and face the reality.
And you weren't going to tell me?
The pain was written all over Sabrina's face. Kelly went for uncomfortable honesty. I guess I didn't want to think it could be true. I was going to wait until after today, then find out for sure before I said anything. I'm so sorry, Sabrina. You know I would never do anything to hurt you.
I know that. Bloody hell. I wish I'd gone downstairs and let Rick put me in charge of sausages,
Sabrina said, and Kelly appreciated the attempt to lighten the mood, but she knew her sister would be dying on the inside. Sabrina and Rick were on their 3rd round of IVF, and she still hadn't fallen pregnant. It had been their sole focus for the last 3 years. It had cost them every penny of profit from Rick's restaurant, the one that Sabrina worked so hard into. Sometimes Kelly worried that the emotional strain would break them. So far they were hanging on, but only just. Yet here she was, 38, with her daughter about to leave home, and the very real possibility that she was pregnant again.
What does Scott think about it?
Kelly's cheeks began to burn again. I haven't told him. Sabrina's eyes widened.
Why not?
The big question. One that Kelly had asked herself a dozen times over the last week. Why not? Perhaps because over the last few months, maybe a year, he'd been so distant that sometimes it felt like the man she'd been married to for more than half her life was a stranger. He'd been so disinterested, so quiet, so disconnected, and she couldn't understand why. An affair would have been the obvious conclusion, but not only was that not in Scott's nature, but he never went anywhere without her or Carney, so she couldn't see where there would be the opportunity. In the end, she'd put it down to the fact that Carney was moving out and he was having some kind of empty nest reaction, maybe some sort of midlife crisis. But when she tried to talk to him about it, he'd insisted nothing was wrong. She knew he was lying. They'd only made love once in the last 6 months, an encounter she'd instigated out of guilt after she'd done something so unthinkable she didn't ever want to revisit it. And she definitely couldn't tell Sabrina about it now or ever. I guess I wanted to wait because I'm pretty sure it's a false alarm, and I didn't want to freak him out. The first part of that sentence was a white lie, but the second part was oh so true.
You do know how babies are made, right?
Sabrina, true to form, went right to the heart of it.
Have you had unprotected sex?
You're hilarious. Despite the sarcasm on both sides, Kelly knew it was a justifiable point. You know that after my surgery we didn't think I'd ever get pregnant again? She reminded her sister of that awful time, just a few years after Carney was born. A ruptured cyst on her left ovary. Surgery, forced removal of the damaged organ. They'd been told that there was still a possibility she could conceive again. For a decade they had lived in hope, but when nothing happened, she'd let the longing go, accepted the situation, and counted their blessings for their one healthy child. Now, almost 20 years after the op, it was almost impossible to comprehend that reality could be drawing a different picture. So we've never used contraception. Just figured it would never happen. Saying it out loud, she could hear just how silly it sounded, yet it was the truth. After 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the thought of another child had evaporated, and it had ceased to be something that she gave headspace to. Until now. Sabrina's sigh was long and soft, and Kelly had a twinge of anxiety as to where they were going to go next with this. Was it going to wreck the rest of the day? Would Sabrina be able to put this out of her mind and celebrate Carney?
Well, we're not going to sort this out sitting here,
Sabrina announced, getting up off the edge of the bath.
You need to know for sure.
Yeah, but there's no way to do that today. I don't have a pregnancy test, and I definitely don't have time to go get one.
I have one with me,
Sabrina said, so quietly that Kelly had to rewind in her head to check she'd heard right. Sabrina registered her confusion and offered an explanation.
My period is due tomorrow, so I brought a test with me.
Oh, honey, Kelly said softly. She had no idea they were waiting for that kind of news this weekend. She should have been a better sister these last few weeks, but she'd been so preoccupied with a dozen other things. Sabrina cut her off.
It's fine, really.
Kelly didn't believe her, but kept quiet and listened.
The test has 2 in the packet. I'll go get it and...
Rick's voice.
Sabrina, are you in the bathroom? Breakfast is on the table. And hurry up, because I've made egg white omelettes and they taste like shoes when they get cold.
Kelly, still kneeling on the floor, had another flashback. Her hanging out the window with a St. Moritz cigarette when she was 15, a 10-year-old Sabrina beside her, awestruck at her big sister's sophistication, until their mother banged on the door, summoning them for dinner.
Just coming,
Sabrina replied with her very best breeziness.
Give me 2 minutes.
OK, and can you wake Kelly and Carney too?
He obviously had no idea the sisters were in there together.
"Will do,"
Sabrina answered, as Rick's steps descended back downstairs. "OK, I can't do a test while he's getting agitated about us coming for breakfast. There's no way I can pee on a stick with that kind of anxiety." Sabrina nodded.
"Yep, I get you. Right, breakfast, and then we'll do it, OK? I'm sorry if I'm pushing you, Kels, but I need to know. I know this isn't about me, but I can't go through the whole day wondering if you're pregnant. I just can't."
Kelly reached over and took her sister's hand. "I understand. I do. After breakfast it is, but not here. My own suite. You go on down and I'll go wake Carney." Sabrina nodded, then opened the door a little to check the coast was clear. Kelly let her go, then waited for a moment so Rick wouldn't catch them if he was in the hall. Kelly took Sabrina's perch on the side of the bath. Damn it. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. But here it was. Today was the day she was going to find out if she was pregnant. Today was the day she might break her sister's heart. And today was the day she may have to tell her husband that they had a baby on the way. The only thing she definitely wasn't going to tell him was the most important thing of all. That for the last 22 years, she'd been in love with someone else. Chapter 4. Harriet Bassett. As always, Harriet was awake long before the lovely nursing assistant came around with the morning teas. This was her last morning.